think 2016 through 2018 was a particular time of the Power Rangers franchise when things were at a peak content-wise. Boom had just started their Power Rangers comics, Renegade was coming out with their Heroes of the Grid tabletop game, Enway was coming out with their Legacy Wars game with Battle for the Grid on the horizon, and in general we were on the cusp of the 25th anniversary of the entire property. And in the middle of all that was something we hadn't gotten since the mid-90s, a big-budget, theatrically released Power Rangers film. Specifically for those who hadn't heard of or seen it, the 2017 film Power Rangers, essentially a modern adaptation of MMPR's first episode of Day at the Dumpster. And we all know nowadays the movie ended up underperforming and plans for it as a film franchise fell through. But at the time, I know I was hyped. I was in college at the time with a cheap movie theater within walking distance from campus, so I was able to buy tickets hours in advance for the first screening, as well as 5 more times afterwards whenever I was bored or had time and could be like, hey, why don't I go see the Power Rangers movie again? It's hard to get a grasp on what fandom nowadays thinks about the film. At the time, it seemed like reception was mixed to negative in the pre-established fandom compared to extremely positive from new fans. Which is not a surprise, this is how it goes in every new adaptation of a long-running IP. I know I look back on that period in the fandom with a lot of fondness with how much hype was surrounding the franchise, and I still enjoy the film enough to rewatch it every year on its anniversary, but what about it holds up and what doesn't 6 years later? For what it's worth, this won't be so much a review of the film in its entirety, but just more of a general discussion on what I think its greatest strengths were and what its greatest weaknesses were. So while I would love to do a full review maybe someday, that won't be in this video. I don't talk about every Ranger and their arc, and I don't talk about the plot. I just want to talk about the movie as a whole. I know for me, the most important part of anything regarding Power Rangers is its main team. A show/franchise whose very essence can be boiled down to the importance of teamwork needs a good charismatic cast to pull off the most ridiculous of circumstances they think of. I fully believe this is partly what made MMPR such a hit back in 1993. And I think this film pulls it off. I'm glad they cast relative newbies/unknowns for the main team and left the big names to side roles. It allowed the chemistry of the main team to pull audiences in rather than just showing off that they put the Stranger Kids things in Ranger suits. And you can tell that was a success with how many Twitter posts I see even nowadays about how the cast deserved a sequel. Even if the writing wasn't great at points, we'll get to that, people were still able to make a connection with this cast and their characters. I also liked how it handled being an MMPR adaptation in general. It wasn't afraid to be its own thing while using the characters and settings we know from the 1993 version of the franchise. One of my biggest criticisms of the comics as a whole is how they seem unsure whether or not they want to commit being in TV continuity or their own continuity. Please don't comment about this. My thoughts on comic stuff belong in their own video. I know I'm probably a minority here, but I like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles strategy of playing around with the characters and how their story can be retold in a new generation rather than trying to awkwardly force itself in the in-betweens of the TV timeline. And slightly related to that, I appreciated how the movie played the silly bits of PR canon completely straight. I'm glad Blue Bryan Cranston was able to call his enemy Rita Repulsa without the teens making a witty comment on how stupid the name was, a la Spider-Man Far From Home. And I'm glad the Rangers had to embrace their bond as a team to morph without shaking our heads and acknowledging how cheesy it is. In an era where people are starting to get sick of the insincerity of superhero movies, it's a refreshing change of pace. Going along with that, a comment I saw at the time and even recently is that a major flaw with the movie is how it's ashamed to be a Power Rangers movie, which is something I don't really agree with to a certain extent. You don't make a movie where the emotional climax is nearly dying to protect a Krispy Kreme and it's played completely straight if you weren't playing into a famously campy source. It kind of ties into the other arguably biggest flaw in the movie, which was that it didn't have enough Power Rangers stuff, and I can kind of see how people would connect the two. And I won't deny that while the main plot of the movie goes into the Rangers needing to learn how to become Rangers and earning their suits, their actual time in the suits is very short, 2 quick battles, before jumping into the Zords for the majority of the climax with the visors open so we can see the marketable actors. The emotional catharsis of finally getting the suits is downplayed by how little we see of the suits, and anyone who knows Power Rangers knows morphing into the suits is only part of the appeal. The 2017 Rangers, or I guess Cenozoic Rangers, as per Battle of the Grid, is kind of the only official name we have for these powers. They have no blade blasters or individual weapons outside of Jason getting a sword out of nowhere. Funnily enough, the individual Zords get more use here than they ever did in the show. However, I don't see this as the filmmakers being ashamed to show Power Rangers stuff. I think it's just a casualty of the assumption that this would turn into a multi-film franchise. I have no doubts that if this series had continued with a sequel, it would have had more suit time and maybe even introduced individual weapons as like a "you have reached the next level of your training" type thing. Basically, my opinion is it could have been worse, okay? I have seen worse. The problem was poor planning rather than any malice, because the real biggest flaw of this movie is its completely whacked pacing. While I like the movie trying to adapt MMPR in a new way, the downside to this comes from how much it tries to do so much in just a little under 2 hours. Unlike the 1993 MMPR movie, which while not in show continuity was basically identical to the show, and the 1995 Turbo movie, which was in show continuity, we are in a whole new universe with new takes on the Rangers and their individual struggles, Zordon's past and his arc, Rita's past and threat levels as a villain, and just the general foundation for this world's take on the Power Rangers lore, such as the Zeo Crystal. Because of this, the movie props the importance of certain characters over others. Jason is the main POV, with Billy and Kim close behind, while Zach and Trini are the most underdeveloped, while still not really executing the main characters that well. As I said, Jason is the main POV character because he's the white boy leader, but his story feels like it's missing some crucial motivations. There's no real reason shown for why he acts out or feels like his dad is in the wrong for being angry at him for potentially throwing away his future. We don't have a sense of what his life was like before the incident that put him on house arrest. Did he have friends on the football team? He must have, because he had accomplices for the mascot prank, but we never see them again after the opening. Do they resent him for getting kicked out and ruining their season? What am I supposed to feel sorry for here? Kimberly's arc, on the other hand, is similar in how there's not enough context to fill in the blanks, but at the same time it's worse because her story goes to further extremes than Jason's angry at dad but still ultimately a good person shtick. Trigger warning for discussions of sexual assault and suicide going further. Yes, really, this isn't a Power Rangers movie. The movie establishes her backstory as a cheerleader ostracized from her friends and sinking into more and more of a pit of self-loathing to the point where it's implied/kind of stated that she has thoughts of self-harm and suicide, which is extremely dark and depressing for an adaptation of a Power Rangers character, let alone Kimberly Hart, even in the movie that has on-screen blood and murder. But okay, sure, fine, this is Power Rangers CW. What makes it worse is the context of the storyline. We learned Kim was kicked out of her friends because she shared a private photo of her friend with her boyfriend in an insulting manner, which her boyfriend called her out on. She punched him in the face for the call-out, and it lands her in detention where she meets Jason and Billy. And for some reason, the movie takes a weird approach where it acknowledges what she did is terrible, but it also tries to excuse it on the grounds that her friends were horrible too, so they deserved it in a way. But we don't see her friends act like anything other than typical high school girls who are rightfully angry that their friend betrayed their trust and insulted them. And even Kim's ex-boyfriend isn't wrong for calling Kim awful for it. And again, the movie/Kim herself acknowledges that he was right to call her terrible for it. I get what they were trying to do here, a sort of redemption arc storyline where a terrible person has an epiphany and makes herself better through company of her new friends and becoming a superhero. It also ties to the plot point of the team needing to connect in order to morph, and Kim's shame over the incident keeps her from sharing, and therefore she believes she's the reason they haven't morphed yet. But as it's shown in the movie, rather than bad person realizes the toxic influence her friends have on her and leaves them for healthier ones, it's bad person hurts her innocent friends and wallows in self-pity until an outsider tells her it's fine, and now we laugh at how her former friends almost get crushed by a rock. I think we're just supposed to assume her friends are terrible by way of them being popular teenage girls, because women be mean, am I right? But from what we see and know of them, they're just teenagers with attitude. Ironically, there was a deleted scene that could have supported the idea that her former friends were toxic, where Kim discovers they tagged her locker with messages telling her to unalive herself. But in the film proper, it never gets worse than a cut-up photo and a mean text. Which, considering this all started because Kim sent a terrible text, it's really hard to convince me that's anything but justified. So she's still my favorite because I'm a Kimberly Ann Hart stan before I'm an actual person, but still extremely hard to sit through as a storyline. She's at her best when she's just being her own character with no reference to the bad plotline. I especially love the scenes where she acts awkward and dorky when talking to Trini. It's very cute and very much like 1993 Kimberly. Also, she's so hot. And I think what makes the lack of time given to fleshing out the Rangers or even giving the suits more prominence worse is that there are a lot of scenes that feel unnecessary or drawn out as padding. The cliff jumping or swimming scene, for instance, go on way too long for no reason. Like, I sit there watching them slow-mo swim for minutes at a time, and I'm just like, man, we could have been watching the scenes where Zach first discovers his powers, which we know exist because they were in the trailer, but not in the deleted scenes for some reason, even though Zach's story is arguably the most interesting. You nerfed him, guys. Why did you do that? In a way, I think that's where I see the movie being the most ashamed of being Power Rangers. In contrast to how the 1995 movie establishes these characters as goody-goods who skydive for a charity foundation, as per they were on the show, this movie goes out of its way to craft the most angst-filled backstories possible as if they're characters on Glee. Which, while I get why they did it, it kind of goes too far to the point where it wraps around to feeling sort of forced and honestly kind of ridiculous. The most positive I can say about this is at the very least allows for some representation that we're only slightly taking further leaps nowadays. Trini being a lesbian is something that's hinted at compared to how we have a full lesbian relationship in Dino Fury, and some that's unfortunately still just limited to this movie, Billy being autistic. I do think Billy's autism rep is very safe. It's very typical, oh, autistic people are socially awkward and remember things, right? And sometimes he's a source of comic relief. But it's commendable that his autism isn't what's being made fun of, as well as him being integral to the plot of the movie. And R.J. Kyler has gone in length to discuss the work he put in to prepare for this role, so at the very least we know effort was put into making this character people could see themselves in, even though they probably should have hired an actor who was actually autistic, but it's 6 years too late to say that, I guess. So at the beginning of this video, I mentioned how fandom reaction was mixed, and I know it sounds like I feel the same, but in the end, no, I associate this film with a very happy time in my life, and just love it for what it is. I love how it unabashedly embraces the Rangers needing to love each other to unlock their powers. I love how Goldar is literally a giant creature made of gold. I think Rita being a Green Ranger is a pretty clever twist. I love Bill Hader Alpha, and to this day I can't listen to that stupid hand clap song without thinking of the training montage. In a way, it represents a time when it felt like Power Rangers was really trying to take off as more than a TV franchise, which I guess it has, but in a way that feels more uncertain and like things could drastically change at any second. I do think ultimately it was a shame they didn't even try to make a sequel, as beyond the good word-of-mouth boost this movie got after it was already written off as a failure, it probably would have been an improvement in many ways that this movie failed. Simply fleshing out pre-established characters and settings rather than working to establish them, more suit time, Tommy Oliver, and of course just seeing this cast back together again, because if you watch this movie for one reason, watch it for them. Other random comments. If you know me, you know I hate Jason Kim as a romance, so I wasn't a fan of it in this movie, mostly because it's another example of the film trying to push way too much into one movie, but also because I just don't like Jason Kim. But also because it's silly to pretend Kim and Jason's relationship has much emotional relevance as Jason Billy. Their relationship is the one that carries the movie, and I know if Billy wasn't black and autistic, they would have been the biggest ship in this fandom. If you call Billy Jason's son, you are on my list, my friend. That being said, Kim Trini becoming the fan favorite ship is one of the better outcomes of this whole situation. Every showing I went to, people audibly went, "Oh!" at two scenes. Jason slapping the bully and when they get hit by the train. So you can't say this movie wasn't emotionally impactful. No matter what, I'm very, very grateful for this movie, for having Amy Jo Johnson and Jason David Frank together on screen for what ended up being the last time. And it was Kim and Tommy, don't at me. AJJ and JDF said they played them like their characters in the deleted scene, called them Tommy and Kim, don't test me, I need this. You probably noticed I didn't talk at all about the sequel comic Aftershock in this review, and that's because the "you're too hot to know about Ultimate Frisbee" line still pisses me off 6 years later. So there's my review of that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for your support on my first one, the Amelia one. A rough plan I'm thinking of for these videos is to maybe drop one at least once a month. depending on what material is available or what news the franchise comes up with that would be worth talking about. I already know next month is April when the Once and Always special is released, so keep an eye out for a video about that. See you next time then.